70 years old, a war hero sits on a cracked bench ignored until 3 officers and 1 K-9 turn a quiet afternoon into a moment that shocks an entire city. What happens next will leave you speechless. Loyalty, memory, and justice collide in ways no one saw coming. Stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it, because this story is bigger than one man, one dog, or one park. 70 years old. That number alone carried more weight than Harold Benton's tired shoulders should have been asked to bear. For 7 decades, he had lived, fought, bled, and survived only to find himself here, on a splintered city park bench in Eastwood Heights, quiet, unnoticed, and invisible. The afternoon sun fell in long golden ribbons across the cracked pavement, but even light seemed to bypass him, sliding off the weathered fabric of his old field jacket, as if reluctant to touch a man forgotten. The jacket itself told a story, though few bothered to read it. Its fabric was faded olive green, threadbare at the elbows, creased at the cuffs where Harold's hands rested. Stitched onto the left breast was a purple heart patch, a small square of cloth that held a lifetime of sacrifice. He had earned it more than 50 years earlier in a jungle halfway around the world when he was just 20 years old. A patch meant for honor had become in this place nothing more than a curiosity at best, or an irrelevance at worst. People's eyes slid over it as though it were decoration, not declaration. Children played on the swings just 20 yards away, their laughter ringing out like silver bells in the heavy air. Parents clutched their toddlers' hands when they noticed Harold. Joggers veered slightly to the right of the path, avoiding his space. Some glanced his way with polite discomfort. Others didn't look at all. To them, he was just another old man on a bench, maybe homeless, maybe troubled, maybe neither. But to Harold, every diverted eye felt like a verdict. The verdict of invisibility. It hadn't always been this way. Once at 19 years old, Harold had been strong, lean shoulders squared under a pack, weighing 80 pounds, boots sinking into Vietnamese mud. Once he had carried comrades across 2 miles of gunfire, ribs broken, blood soaking into his fatigues. Once he had been saluted, respected, called soldier and brother. But the decades since had eroded that recognition like rain wearing down stone. In Eastwood Heights, in this very park, Harold Benton wasn't a veteran. He wasn't a survivor. He was simply that old black man sitting too long. The bench itself had become his refuge. Each day at precisely 2 in the afternoon, Harold walked slowly down Maple Street, his cane tapping lightly against the uneven sidewalk, and lowered himself onto the same spot under the same oak tree. The wood creaked beneath his weight, a familiar sound, like an old friend's sigh. He sat not to disturb, not to protest, not to claim anything, but space to breathe. For Harold, breathing in peace was an act of survival. He would tilt his head back, let the sunlight warm his face, and close his eyes against the noise of the city. But to others, his stillness carried suspicion. Stillness in a 70-year-old black man wasn't seen as rest. It was seen as defiance. A young mother tugged her daughter closer when they passed. Harold caught the child's eyes for just a second, wide, curious, innocent. But then she was pulled away. Her small hand swallowed in her mother's fear. Harold knew that look. He had seen it in Saigon in faces that feared not what they knew, but what they imagined. Fear that judged, first asked never. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had lived through gunfire only to be treated as a ghost in peacetime. He had carried a Purple Heart home only to find that the heart of his own country was still cold to him. The bench, scarred with carvings of initials and graffiti, was his only audience. It didn't flinch when he coughed. It didn't recoil when his dark skin gleamed in the sun. It didn't whisper assumptions. It simply held him steady and silent as if saying, "You belong here, even if no one else will admit it." Around him, Eastwood Heights thrummed with life. The park's cracked fountain gurgled faintly. A vendor sold popsicles for $2 apiece at the corner. A group of teenagers sprawled on the grass earbuds, scrolling endlessly on glowing screens. Life flowed on, measured in footsteps and minutes, but Harold seemed suspended outside of time. It was as if he were the park's shadow present, but unseen breathing, but overlooked. Every day he wore that jacket not out of vanity, but memory. The purple heart patch was a whisper to himself. You are real. You mattered once. Yet no one asked him about it. No one asked what it meant to be wounded for a country that now pretended not to see him. Instead, they hurried by, glancing sideways, wondering how long that man would sit there. 10 minutes, an hour. Too long, always too long. Harold leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, staring at the ground, where dandelions pushed through cracks in the pavement. His calloused palms, darkened by years of hard labor, looked almost carved from stone. They had dug trenches, gripped rifles, lifted men heavier than himself. Now they simply rested open, quiet, unwanted. He wondered not for the first time if silence itself could be a crime, if breathing in stillness could be judged as provocation. The clock tower on Eastwood Avenue chimed 3 times 3 long, hollow notes. An hour had passed since Harold had arrived. An hour in which he had done nothing but sit. An hour in which the world had walked past, some whispering, some avoiding, none acknowledging. An hour in which the city of Eastwood Heights had confirmed what Harold already knew: he was invisible, until they decided he wasn't. But Harold Benton wasn't invisible to himself. He carried his 70 years like armor, every scar a reminder of survival. His purple heart patch was more than fabric, it was testimony. His seat on the bench wasn't loitering, it was living. And though no one spoke to him, though no one asked, though no one cared to see him, Harold knew something they did not. Invisibility can turn into resistance, and resistance can spark reckoning. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible above the rustle of the oak leaves overhead. It was a soldier's exhale, controlled, deliberate, the kind of breath that steadies you before a storm. He didn't know yet that in minutes the storm would arrive in the form of 3 officers and 1 leashed animal. He didn't know yet that his quiet existence on a splintered bench would ignite a city's conscience. For now, Harold Benton sat still, cloaked in invisibility, wrapped in memory, waiting for the world to notice what it had tried so hard to forget. And, as the late afternoon sun stretched shadows across Eastwood Heights, Harold's figure remained a man carved from 70 years of survival, holding on to dignity in the face of erasure. Forgotten by passers-by, ignored by neighbors, overlooked by the city. Yet in that forgetting a story was brewing, a reckoning assembling piece by piece, second by second. The forgotten veteran was about to be remembered, not because he demanded it, but because truth has a way of breaking through even when the world tries to look away. The clock tower struck 3 times, and with each hollow note, Harold Benton felt the weight of another hour spent unseen. His presence on the bench was as ordinary as the sun on the grass, yet the world had a way of twisting stillness into suspicion. It began the way storms always do not, with lightning but with murmurs. A call made from across the park. A voice on the police radio reporting a man sitting too long. Loitering, they called it. Loitering, as though 70 years of survival could be reduced to a crime of sitting. Harold didn't know the call had been made. He only sensed the shift in the air, the way silence sometimes thickened before thunder rolled. The children's laughter grew faint, joggers slowed, and heads turned in quiet calculation. He felt eyes linger on him just a second longer than before. It was the gaze of neighbors deciding someone else's presence was out of place. And in this country, that decision was all it took to summon authority. From across Maple Street, the first uniform appeared. Officer Derek Mills walked with the brisk stride of a man convinced before he arrived. He was tall, mid-40s, with a square jaw and a stare that measured everything in terms of compliance. Derek Mills didn't need to hear Harold's voice to form his judgment. His conclusion was written in the color of Harold's skin, the slouch of his shoulders, the age that weighed his bones. To Mills, Harold Benton was already a problem. The details were unimportant. Flanking him on the left was Officer Craig Linton, younger, leaner, barely 30 years old, but already wearing arrogance like body armor. His stride carried a swagger sharpened by impatience, the kind of gait that said he didn't walk toward situations to understand them, he walked to dominate them. His right hand hovered near his holster, not gripping but twitching, as though the weight of his weapon gave him purpose. His mouth curled in the beginnings of a smirk, the expression of a man who enjoyed confrontation more than conversation. On the right trailed Officer Brian Keller, the K-9 handler. His hand gripped the thick black leash of Ranger, a muscular German shepherd, trained in pursuit, takedowns, and intimidation. Ranger's ears were pricked forward, his chest expanding and contracting with sharp breaths, each inhale tuned to his handler's nerves. The leash was taut, already stretched, as though anticipating the command that would set him free. Keller's eyes darted between his partners, and the figure on the bench, his jaw clenched, but uncertain. He was not the loudest among them, but his silence carried its own danger, the silence of a man who obeyed orders without question. The trio moved like a single machine across the park's cracked concrete path, boots striking rhythmically, radios buzzing faintly at their belts. It was 3:15 in the afternoon when they reached the edge of the oak tree's shade, but time in that moment stretched long and heavy. Harold heard them before he saw them, the shuffle of tactical fabric, the jingle of keys, the metallic brush of gear plates. He didn't turn his head. He didn't shift his weight. He only breathed deeper, steadier, his spine straightening as though bracing against invisible wind. "Afternoon, sir." Officer Mills's voice carried the flat cadence of formality, but beneath it simmered something colder, an assumption of guilt. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if Harold needed help. He approached like a man reciting a line from a play already rehearsed 1,000 times. Craig Linton didn't wait for his superior. He stepped forward half a pace, eyes narrowing, voice sharp. "You live around here." His tone wasn't a question. It was a challenge, the kind of question that already contained its answer. Harold turned his head slowly, deliberately, to meet the young officer's gaze. His voice, when it came, was low, but steady. "I do." "Funny," Linton sneered. "Most folks don't sit here for hours unless they're hiding something." Harold's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. "I'm not hiding. I'm remembering." The words seemed to irritate Linton more than a refusal would have. He took another step closer, boots grinding into the dirt. The German shepherd growled low in his throat, a rumble that vibrated through the leash into Keller's tense grip. The crowd had begun to notice. A jogger slowed, pulling out an earbud. A couple pushing a stroller veered toward the curb, but glanced back nervously. Teenagers lying on the grass sat upright, phones angled discreetly in their hands. The park's pulse shifted, and with it Harold felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the battlefield instincts he thought he'd left behind half a century ago. Mills stepped in, his voice cooler but no less commanding. "Sir, we had a call. Said you've been here a while." "I come here every day," Harold replied evenly. "This is where I sit." Craig Linton scoffed, shaking his head. "ID. Let's see it." The ritual had begun. Harold reached slowly, his movements deliberate, his mind recalling every caution drilled into him by survival. No sudden gestures, no raised voice, no defiance that could be mistaken for aggression. He pulled his worn wallet from his pocket, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He opened it to reveal his faded Army ID. The edges frayed, the lettering dulled from decades of folding and unfolding. The Purple Heart designation was faint, but still visible. Mills hesitated, his eyes flickering for just a second at the word veteran. But Linton didn't pause. He glanced at it, smirked, and muttered, "Could be fake. You can buy this crap anywhere." The words landed like shrapnel. For Harold, it was worse than a bullet. In Vietnam, at 20 years old, he had taken a round through the shoulder and carried a man 200 yards under fire. He had earned that patch, that ID, that recognition. And yet, here he was, half a century later, having his life reduced to a pawn-shop forgery. Ranger growled again, louder this time. Keller's hand tightened around the leash, but he didn't pull back. He waited. The dog's body language mirrored the tension of his handler's trained obedience caught between instinct and command. Harold didn't move. He kept his hands visible, resting on his knees, the ID open for the world to see. "I fought for this country," he said quietly, his voice cracked but unwavering, "bled for people who wouldn't look me in the eye, buried friends who never came home." Mills shifted his weight, his face betraying a flicker of discomfort. Keller looked down, uncertain, but Linton's sneer widened his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "And now, you're out here making folks uncomfortable. That's enough for me." The words hung heavy in the humid air. Uncomfortable. That single word, weaponized for generations, turned presence into offense, silence into provocation. Harold sat straighter, not because he wasn't afraid, but because 70 years had taught him that dignity was sometimes the only shield a man could carry. The seconds ticked like thunder. 3 officers, 1 dog. Dozens of eyes watching. The air around the oak tree thickened with the weight of what was coming. Harold inhaled slowly, his chest rising against the faded fabric of his field jacket. His Purple Heart patch caught the afternoon light just as Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating like an engine at the edge of ignition. And in that moment, Harold Benton knew he was no longer invisible. He was a target. The ID card trembled faintly in Harold Benton's hand, not because of fear, but because the edges had been handled so many times over 5 decades that it was more memory than paper. The laminated surface, cracked and yellowed, still carried the faint outline of his 19-year-old face, jaw, sharp eyes blazing with the fire of survival. The words, United States Army and Purple Heart, shimmered faintly when the sun caught them. It was proof, a testament to his life. But in the wrong hands, even proof could be stripped of meaning. Officer Derek Mills leaned closer, his shadow falling across Harold's knees. He studied the card with the tired eyes of a man more concerned with procedure than truth. To him, Harold wasn't a veteran. He was a line on a call sheet, an assignment to close. "You've been here a while," Mills said flatly, his tone neither hostile nor kind. Just indifferent. Indifference cut sharper than anger. It told Harold he was already guilty of existing. Before Harold could answer, Officer Craig Linton snatched a glance at the ID, his smirk curling into something sharper. "This real?" he asked mockingly, his voice pitched loud enough for the forming crowd. "Looks like something you pick up at a pawn shop. Seen plenty of those fakes." He flipped his hand dismissively, as though Harold's 70 years and scarred body could be erased with a shrug. The words lodged in Harold's chest like shrapnel. He had carried men 200 yards under gunfire, ribs broken, shoulder bleeding, and yet, here in this city park, he was reduced to a counterfeit. The humiliation was almost physical. He exhaled slowly, the way he had in the jungle 50 years earlier when bullets cracked through the trees. Stay calm. Don't flinch. Every movement is a test. Ranger the German Shepherd strained harder at the leash. His claws scraped the concrete path with a harsh screech. The sound silenced a few whispers in the crowd. Brian Keller, the K9 handler, tightened his grip, knuckles whitening. His voice was low, almost muttered but audible to Harold. "Easy, boy. Easy." But the leash remained taut, vibrating with tension, as though transmitting the unease of every man in uniform standing there. The crowd grew thicker, drawn like iron filings, to the magnetic hum of confrontation. By 3:30, a dozen onlookers stood within 20 feet of the bench. Some held phones at waist level, pretending to scroll while cameras recorded. A teenage boy whispered to his friend, "Why are they bothering him? He's just sitting." His friend shrugged eyes, never leaving the scene, thumb poised over the record button. Harold noticed them, but he didn't let it show. Attention was dangerous. Witnesses were unpredictable. Some became shields. Others became fuel. He focused on his breathing 1 second in 1 second, outmeasured like a soldier conserving air in a gas mask. His spine remained straight hands, visible body still. The choreography of survival hadn't left him in half a century. Linton leaned closer, his smirk hardening into accusation. "So what's the story, old man? Sitting here all day, flashing a card nobody can read. You trying to hustle sympathy, or you hiding something?" His voice cracked like a whip across the park. "I'm not hiding anything," Harold replied, calm, steady. His words were quiet, but they carried. "I came here to breathe." The simplicity of the answer seemed to irritate Linton even more. He stepped forward, boots crunching gravel, his shadow now covering Harold's hands. "Yeah. And why should we believe that? Why should we take your word?" At that moment, Mills raised a hand slightly as if to temper his partner. His eyes lingered on the faded ID a second longer than before. Maybe he saw the truth in it. Maybe he saw the boy Harold once was. But he didn't speak. His silence was permission. And silence, Harold knew, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The tension rolled outward. A young mother clutched her daughter tighter, whispering, "Stay back." An elderly man shook his head, muttering, "Shameful. Just shameful." A jogger pulled out her phone openly. Now camera raised her chest, heaving from the run, as she captured the standoff. Ranger barked suddenly, one sharp explosive sound that made a toddler cry out and a woman drop her coffee. Keller jerked the leash back, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. He was no longer sure who was controlling whom, him or the dog. Harold didn't flinch, not an inch. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, his breathing steady. He knew the truth. To move was to risk escalation. To remain still was the only defense. "I fought for this country," Harold said finally, his voice louder now, carrying over the park's uneasy silence. "Bled for people who never knew my name. Buried friends who didn't come home." For a split second, Mills's face flickered. Keller's grip loosened imperceptibly. But Linton laughed sharp and brittle. "And now what you expect a medal for sitting on a bench?" His words cut the air like glass. The crowd reacted this time. A murmur of outrage rippled outward. A woman gasped audibly. The teenage boy shook his head, muttering, "That's messed up." Someone whispered, "He's a vet. Look at his jacket." The atmosphere shifted. Harold was no longer invisible. He was no longer alone. The witnesses had become participants, their outrage simmering just beneath the surface. But Harold remained the same, still calm, unmoving. His hands rested lightly on his knees, fingers curled just enough to stop the tremor of anger that wanted to rise. He had learned long ago that rage was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Every second was measured, every gesture calculated, every word weighed against the possibility of violence. By 3:40, the tension was unbearable. Ranger growled again, deeper this time, vibrating in Harold's chest like a drumbeat. Keller's breath quickened, his knuckles white on the leash. Mills shifted uneasily, torn between duty and doubt. Linton's smirk hardened into hostility. And Harold Benton, 70 years old Purple Heart veteran, sat perfectly still, his very existence transformed into defiance. Inside, though, Harold's heart pounded. Not with fear, but with memory. He remembered the jungle mud, the metallic stench of blood, the deafening sound of helicopters overhead. He remembered crouching still as stone while enemy patrols passed within 10 feet. He remembered learning that survival wasn't about running, it was about waiting, breathing, enduring. And now, 50 years later, that same training, that same stillness, was saving him again. The crowd's whispers grew louder. He's not doing anything. Why are they bothering him? That's a veteran. Their voices swelled, feeding one another, emboldened by the injustice playing out in front of their eyes. Phones rose higher. Cameras zoomed in. The spectacle was no longer private. It was public, recorded, eternal. But the officers didn't step back. They didn't reconsider. Mills's silence, Linton's aggression, Keller's leash all pressed forward inch by inch like gears in a machine, grinding toward inevitability. Harold knew what was coming. He had seen it too many times before. The leash tightening, the bark escalating, the command shouted, the rush of muscle and teeth, and yet he remained still. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear had been his companion for 70 years. He knew how to carry it without showing it. He knew how to turn stillness into strength. As the sun dipped, lower shadows stretching across the park, Harold Benton sat on that bench, ID card still in hand, Purple Heart patch still glinting faintly in the fading light. Around him, suspicion grew into accusation, accusation into threat. But he did not yield, because every movement was a test. And Harold Benton had been passing tests his whole life. He was ready for this one too. The air in Eastwood Heights Park had thickened to the point where every breath felt like it might shatter. It was 3:45 in the afternoon when Officer Craig Linton stepped closer, his shadow stretching across Harold Benton's legs. The crowd's whispers had swelled into an uneasy hum, but Linton didn't hear them. Or maybe he did, and that only fueled him. His voice cracked the fragile silence like a whip. "All right, old man," he barked, his tone sharp enough to slice the tension. "Stand up. Move along. Park's not for sitting all day." The words landed heavy not because of their volume, but because of their weight carrying the unspoken accusation that Harold Benton's very existence was offensive. It wasn't the bench. It wasn't the time. It wasn't the routine he had kept for 5 years. It was him, his skin, his stillness, his quiet refusal to disappear. Harold lifted his gaze slow and steady until it locked with Linton's eyes. His spine straightened another inch, his shoulders squared under the faded field jacket with the Purple Heart patch. His voice, when it came, was calm, resonant, and measured, carrying the cadence of 70 years, lived with both dignity and pain. "I fought for this country," Harold said, each syllable deliberate, each word carved from memory. "I have the right to sit here." The sentence wasn't shouted. It wasn't desperate. It was firm, steady, like a man planting a flag into soil that others wanted to strip away. For a heartbeat, even Ranger the German shepherd went quiet, ears twitching as if he sensed the gravity in the words. Linton scoffed, stepping back half a pace, as though the truth in Harold's tone unsettled him more than defiance ever could. "Don't give me speeches," he spat. Rules are rules. You made people uncomfortable, and that's enough. The crowd reacted this time. A murmur swelled, pushing outward like ripples in water. A man near the swings whispered, "Uncomfortable." That's the excuse. A woman holding a stroller shook her head, muttering, "That's a veteran." The murmurs grew louder, coiling into words that no longer feared being overheard. Phones began to rise. First one, then three, then nearly a dozen. Screens glowed like small sun's lenses aimed at the unfolding scene. Teenagers whispered to each other, "Get this. Get it all." The circle of onlookers began to form 30 feet out, then 20, then closing in, until Harold was no longer just a man on a bench. He was the center of an impromptu stage, the oak tree above him, the canopy of a courtroom not sanctioned by law, but by truth. Officer Derek Mills shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward the cameras. His silence had always been his shield, but silence under the glare of witnesses felt different. Officer Brian Keller's grip on Ranger's leash tightened, the leather strap vibrating with the animal's restrained energy. The dog's breathing came quick, shallow, his instincts feeding off the unease. But Harold didn't flinch. His hands stayed visible, resting calmly on his knees, the worn ID card still held between his fingers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply sat, and by sitting, he resisted. It wasn't passive. It wasn't surrender. It was the stubborn dignity of a man who had carried comrades through 2 miles of jungle gunfire at the age of 19, and who wasn't about to be ordered off a public bench at 70. Sir Mills finally said, his voice softer but still carrying authority. "You're escalating this by refusing to cooperate." The irony stung Harold like a lash. Escalation! He was the only one not moving, the only one not shouting, the only one not tightening leashes or reaching for belts. Yet here he was, accused of escalation, for choosing to remain still. His chest rose slowly, his breath heavy, but steady. "I am not escalating," he replied. "I am existing." The crowd stirred again, their voices louder now. "He's not doing anything," one teenager called out, his phone raised high. "Leave him alone," shouted another voice, female, cracking with indignation. The circle tightened further, 30 onlookers now, then 40, their presence pressing in like the walls of a theater. Linton's jaw tightened, his smirk replaced by something closer to fury. He didn't like being watched. He didn't like being challenged. His voice rose louder, harsher, carrying to every corner of the park. "Stand up now," he ordered, his hand twitching near his belt. Harold's voice rose too, not in volume, but in clarity. "No," he said, steady as bedrock. "I fought for this country. I bled for this country. I buried friends who never came home. I will not stand up because you are uncomfortable. I will not move because you cannot see me as human. This bench is mine as much as it is yours." The park fell still, the kind of stillness that comes before storms, when even birds stop singing. Ranger growled again, a low rumble that vibrated through Keller's arm. A mother covered her daughter's ears, shielding her from the sound. The teenage boy with the phone whispered, "Oh my God," his hands trembling as he filmed. By 3:55, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people. Their circle was wide, but unbroken cameras, flashing whispers, rising into chants of disapproval. "He's a vet," someone shouted. "Let him sit, another called." The officers' faces tightened, their authority eroding under the weight of witnesses. Linton leaned forward, his voice cutting desperate now. "You think sitting makes you untouchable. You think a dusty jacket and an old card mean anything to me." His words cracked through the air like gunfire. But this time, instead of silence, they were met with a surge of murmurs, louder, angrier. Harold did not waver. His hands remained calm, his eyes steady. His stillness wasn't weakness. It was defiance. It was the declaration that after 70 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and doubted, he would not yield simply because a young man with a badge decided he didn't belong. The circle of onlookers thickened, their phones raised higher now, their voices braver. "We're recording," one man shouted. "We see you," cried a woman, her voice trembling with outrage. The balance of power began to shift, not with fists, not with weapons, but with eyes, dozens of them bearing witness, refusing to look away. Linton glanced around, his swagger faltering under the weight of so many stares. Mills's jaw clenched, the burden of silence heavier than ever. Keller shifted uneasily, Ranger's leash taut in his grip. The veteran sat calmly at the center, a man carved from 70 years of survival, holding his ground not with aggression, but with existence. At 4 o'clock, the moment reached its breaking point. Harold Benton sat on that worn bench beneath the oak tree, the crowd forming a living shield around him, their phones aimed like weapons of truth. The officers stood in front of him, their authority cracking like glass. And between them all, the air vibrated with tension, an old man's stillness against the restless force of power. Harold breathed deeply, his chest rising with the weight of decades. His voice was steady as stone. "I will not move." And in that single sentence, the world shifted. It was 4:05 in the afternoon when the fragile line between suspicion and violence finally snapped. The circle of onlookers had swelled to nearly 60 people, their phones raised high, their whispers sharpening into open defiance. Harold Benton sat still on the bench, his purple heart patch catching the last fragments of sun, his ID card trembling faintly in his weathered hand. He had said it once, firm and unyielding, "I will not move." That declaration hung in the air like a verdict the officers didn't want, but couldn't erase. Officer Derek Mills hesitated. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between Harold's steady face and the semicircle of recording lenses. He could feel the weight of accountability pressing in from every angle. The right thing, the human thing, would have been to lower his hand, to step back, to let the veteran remain seated. But procedure, pride, and fear bound him silent. Mills's hesitation was visible, the half-second pause of a man who knew the next step would define him. Officer Craig Linton couldn't stomach the pause. His arrogance thrived on momentum, and hesitation tasted like weakness. His lips curled into a sneer, his voice cracking like a whip across the hushed crowd. "Deploy the dog," he snapped, his order sharp and undeniable. It was 3 words that cut through every murmur, 3 words that transformed suspicion into sanctioned aggression. The crowd gasped, a collective inhale that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the park. The teenage boy with the phone muttered, "No, no, no," his camera trembling. A mother clutched her daughter so tightly the child whimpered. Someone whispered, "Not here. Not now." But it was already happening. Brian Keller froze for a fraction of a second, his grip on Ranger's leash rigid, his knuckles white. He glanced at Mills, but the senior officer said nothing. Silence again. Silence as complicity. Silence as surrender. Keller's pulse thundered in his ears. Protocol demanded obedience. His partner's command left no space for doubt. And so, with the smallest flick of his wrist, Keller loosened the strap. The leash snapped forward, leather sliding against his palm, and Ranger surged like a missile freed from its launch pad. 80 pounds of muscle and instinct exploded into motion, claws tearing at the concrete jaws, bared eyes locked on the target. The dog's growl deepened into a roar, guttural and terrifying, the sound of years of training weaponized in a single command. The park convulsed with sound. A child screamed high and piercing as her mother covered her eyes. A man dropped his soda, the paper cup bursting across the pavement like a gunshot. Gasps and shouts erupted from every direction, 60 voices rising in chaos, fear, outrage. Harold Benton did not move. His spine stayed straight, his hands still resting on his knees, the ID card clutched between his fingers. The instinct to flinch, to run, to shield himself pulsed through every nerve, but 70 years had taught him a different discipline. He breathed once deep and steady, his eyes fixed on the blur of black and tan hurtling toward him. Ranger closed the distance fast, 10 feet, then 8, then 5. His muscles rippled, his paws pounding the earth with the rhythm of inevitability. The sound was deafening, claws scraping, breath heaving, the leash snapping loose against Keller's frantic grip. To the crowd, it was a nightmare unfolding in real-time violence, descending on a 70-year-old man whose only crime was sitting still. A teenage girl shrieked, "Stop him!" but no hand reached out. No one dared. The authority of uniforms froze the crowd in place, trapping them as horrified witnesses. Every phone camera trembled, capturing not just the dog, but the terror in their own reflections. For Harold, time fractured. Each second stretched long memories, flooding the space between heartbeats. He was 19 again, crouched in a muddy trench in Vietnam, the air thick with smoke and gunfire. He heard the snap of bullets overhead, the cries of men falling, the bark of another German shepherd, sniffing out wounded soldiers. He remembered the weight of a comrade slung across his back, the agony of a bullet tearing into his shoulder, the relentless command inside his head. Do not fall. Do not give in. Now, half a century later, the battlefield had followed him home. It wore badges, it carried leashes, and it moved on him with the same certainty of death. 4 feet. 3, 2. Ranger's teeth gleamed in the sunlight, saliva catching the air as his jaws snapped open. The crowd's gasps blended into one scream, one collective plea to stop what could not be stopped. But Harold Benton remained rooted. His knees pressed firm against the wood of the bench, his back tall against the oak's shadow. His stillness was not fear, it was defiance. It was the discipline of a soldier who had already faced death and refused to bow. He whispered, barely audible, "I will not run." The park held its breath. Every eye locked on the moment of impact, every camera trained on the blur of muscle and teeth, every heart beating in terrified rhythm. The dog lunged, the veteran sat, and the thin line between survival and tragedy grew thinner than paper. At 4:06 in the afternoon, the park braced for impact. 80 pounds of German shepherd muscle tore across the ground, paws pounding like war drums, jaws open, teeth flashing like ivory knives. The crowd screamed, a cacophony of terror that rolled across the playground, the jogging path, the fountain. Mothers pulled children close. Teenagers shouted curses, their phones shaking as they tried to capture the collision they feared was inevitable. And then something broke. 3 feet from Harold Benton's chest, Ranger faltered. His stride stuttered, his claws screeched against the pavement as if slamming into memory itself. The growl in his throat cracked, fractured into a confused whine. His ears twitched backward, his tail hesitated mid-snap, and instead of lunging teeth first into an elderly man's body, he slowed, shoulders hunching, head tilting. The park gasped, not in fear this time, but in shock. Silence spread like a wave, devouring the screams, the shouts, the outrage. The only sound was Ranger's paws skidding across the concrete, then the low, pitiful whimper of a beast torn between command and recognition. He crept forward the last foot, not with violence but with reverence, lowering his nose toward Harold's outstretched hand. Harold had not moved. Not an inch. His spine still straight, his knees still rooted to the wood of the bench, his breath still measured like a soldier under fire. But his eyes softened just barely, and his lips moved with words that trembled out like prayers. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" he whispered. His voice cracked, roughened by 70 years of smoke, sweat, and silence. "It's me," Ranger whined again, a long, aching sound that carried through the stunned park. His body collapsed against Harold's knees, his muzzle pressing into the faded field jacket. He nuzzled into the fabric, his chest heaving as though he had found something lost. His tail wagged once, uncertain, then again faster, thumping against the bench like a drumbeat of reunion. The crowd gasped louder this time, but it was not terror, it was disbelief. Awe, something close to reverence. Phones zoomed in, capturing the impossible, the same dog unleashed to maim, now pressed against Harold's chest, not as weapon, but as friend. Harold's trembling hand slid gently over Ranger's head, his fingers tracing the fur with the tenderness of recognition. He bent forward, forehead resting against the dog's, his voice breaking into a rasp. "Good boy," he murmured. "You still know me." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Officer Brian Keller's jaw dropped his knuckles, still clutching the loose leash that dangled uselessly from his hand. His partner's command had been clear, but the animal had betrayed it. Or maybe it hadn't betrayed anything. Maybe it had remembered something deeper, older, truer than orders. Officer Craig Linton's face drained of color. He had expected blood. He had wanted fear. Instead, he stood in front of 60 witnesses, watching his authority crumble under the weight of a wagging tail. His voice cracked, brittle, desperate. That doesn't make sense. Dogs don't just... He stopped, choking on words that refused to come. Officer Derek Mills took a step back, his silence no longer a shield, but a confession. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet the eyes of the man they had tried to erase. Harold bent lower, whispering into Ranger's ear, his voice breaking. "You remember the jungle, don't you? The drills, the shouts, the nights we kept each other alive." His eyes glistened not with fear, but with memory. Decades fell away in an instant. He wasn't 70 anymore. He was 19, crouched in mud up to his knees, giving hand signals to dogs trained to sniff out ambushes, leading men through forests thick with death. Ranger wasn't the same dog. No time would never allow that. But his lineage was. The training, the imprint, the connection Harold's touch had imprinted generations ago, carried forward through the lines of K9s bred and trained in military service. The park erupted, not in chaos, but in disbelief. A woman covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. A man muttered, "He knows him." The dog knows him. Teenagers whispered furiously, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" their cameras capturing every second. A child, the same one who had screamed earlier now, whispered to her mother, "The dog's hugging him." And in truth, that's what it looked like. Ranger pressed his massive body against Harold's chest, curling into the man as though shielding him from the very officers who had unleashed him. His growl was gone, replaced by small, breathy whines, the kind of sound dogs make when they have found home. Linton tried again, his voice rising, breaking. This is some kind of trick. Dogs don't do that unless they've been trained." But that was exactly the point. They had been trained. Decades earlier, Harold had stood in a dusty yard, in uniform, teaching German shepherds how to track, how to protect, how to recognize. That training had flowed like blood through generations passed from one K9 unit to the next, lineage carrying memory like a buried flame. Ranger wasn't meeting a stranger. He was meeting the echo of a man who had once been his teacher, his brother in arms, his protector. Harold's voice rose just enough for the crowd to hear, low and steady but carrying the weight of truth. I trained dogs like this. I led them, fed them, carried them through fire. And today, he carried me. The crowd erupted, this time not in fear, but in outrage turned into solidarity. "He's a veteran," someone shouted. "You unleashed a dog on a veteran," another voice cracked. Phones waved higher. Witnesses cried out the truth, undeniable. Keller dropped to one knee, his eyes wide, his voice a whisper. "I've never seen him act like this. Never disobeyed. Never once." His hand hovered over Ranger's back, but the dog didn't flinch. He stayed pressed into Harold's chest-tail, thumping softly against the bench, a living verdict against his handler's silence. Mills swallowed hard, his throat tight. "God help us," he muttered under his breath. Linton stood frozen, his hand twitching near his belt, his eyes darting between the dog, the veteran, the crowd. His authority, once absolute, now looked hollow under the light of 60 witnesses and one dog's loyalty. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked again. This doesn't prove anything." But Harold Benton had already spoken the truth, without needing volume or anger. He stroked Ranger's fur eyes, closed, his voice soft but steady. "You don't need to believe me. He already does." At 4:10, the park was transformed. What had begun as an ordinary confrontation was now a theater of reckoning. Phones captured the impossible, an old black veteran once invisible, now embraced by the very dog unleashed to destroy him. Ranger's whines filled the silence like music, each sound a note of memory, each wag of his tail a strike against prejudice. Harold breathed deeply, his forehead still resting against the animal's head. "You remember me," he whispered again, his voice cracking under 70 years of weight. "And that's enough." The crowd erupted into applause, not polite, not restrained, but raw, tearful, thunderous. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition. It was the sound of truth breaking chains. And in that moment, Harold Benton was no longer invisible. He was undeniable. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the park held its breath. Ranger 80 pounds of trained muscle was no longer a weapon, but a witness pressed against Harold Benton's chest-tail, thumping softly against the bench. The crowd had erupted in gasps and disbelief, their phones recording the impossible, a police K9 unleashed to attack, but instead bowing at the feet of the man it had been ordered to destroy. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, balanced on the edge of something monumental. And then from within the crowd a voice broke through, a voice deep-weathered but still commanding. "That man is a hero." The words cut through the silence like thunder splitting the sky. Heads turned, phones pivoted. The crowd parted slowly, almost reverently, as a tall figure stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, silver hair gleaming under the late sunlight, his posture still as straight as it had been decades earlier in uniform. His chest carried the weight of medals, not pinned now, but remembered in the rigid way he carried himself. His eyes, sharp, unwavering, locked on Harold. It was Samuel Price. Colonel retired, a man who had fought in the same hellish jungles as Harold, a man whose story was bound to Harold's by fire and blood. At 72, his gait was slower, but every step toward the bench was deliberate, purposeful, as though each one carried the authority of a lifetime of command. The officers stiffened instinctively, their training recognizing the gravity of the presence moving toward them. Officer Derek Mills shifted uneasily, his silence now cracking into guilt. Officer Brian Keller's grip on the useless leash faltered, his face pale. But it was Officer Craig Linton who flinched, the hardest his bravado, shrinking under the weight of something he could not mock, could not dismiss. Authority was about to change hands. Colonel Price stopped 10 feet from the bench, his voice rising again, steady as stone. "I know this man. I know Harold Benton." His hand lifted, pointing firmly at the veteran seated with Ranger pressed into his chest. 52 years ago in Da Nang, I lay bleeding with 2 bullets in my leg. My unit scattered my life, draining out of me. This man, his voice cracked with memory. This man carried me 3 kilometers through open fire. 3 kilometers. With shrapnel in his own body, with death snapping at his heels. He carried me because he refused to let another man die alone. The park erupted again, but this time with a wave of stunned murmurs, a chorus of gasps. Oh my God! He saved him. 3 kilometers. The numbers alone hit like grenades in the silence. 3 kilometers under fire was not survival. It was miracle. Colonel Price stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stood tall beside Harold, his presence both shield and witness. His voice rose louder, carrying across the semicircle of onlookers, the officers, the cameras that were now live-streaming to hundreds, maybe thousands. This man is a hero, not a suspect, not a loiterer. A hero. And you, his gaze snapped to the officers, you dared to sick a dog on him. The crowd broke into shouts now, outrage spilling like wildfire. Shame, one woman cried. He saved lives, another man shouted. A teenage boy's voice cracked with anger. You tried to attack a hero. Officer Linton's smirk vanished entirely. His lips pressed thin, his face flushed crimson. He sputtered. That doesn't change the fact, but his words died in his throat under the glares of 60 witnesses and the booming presence of Samuel Price. Colonel Price's eyes burned into him. It changes everything. You didn't ask who he was. You didn't care. You saw a black man on a bench and decided that was threat enough. His finger jabbed the air, his words sharp as bullets. And now the truth has exposed you in front of your own city. Mills looked down his shoulders, sagging his silence more damning than any confession. Keller crouched lower, reaching out instinctively toward Ranger, but the dog pressed harder into Harold's chest, refusing to move. Even the animal had chosen its side. Harold, still seated, still calm, raised his head just enough to meet the colonel's eyes. His voice was quiet but clear. Sam. Colonel Price's hardened face softened for the first time. His eyes glistened with memory, with gratitude, with recognition. Harold, he said, voice trembling, I would not be standing here today if not for you. He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising into a crescendo. And neither would hundreds of others because Harold Benton saved lives. He fought for this country, bled for it, gave it everything. And today, here in this park, he's treated like a criminal. The balance of power shifted visibly. The officers, once standing as the embodiment of authority, now looked small, diminished, exposed under the gaze of their own community. Phones recorded every twitch of their faces, every tremor of shame. The mayor's office would see it. The news would air it. The nation would know. The crowd's energy swelled, no longer whispers, but chants. Hero, hero, hero. The word thundered across the park, a verdict louder than any judge's gavel. Children echoed it, their small voices rising above the din. Even the trees seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Linton tried one last time, his voice sharp but quivering. Procedure. We were following. Procedure. No, Colonel Price interrupted, his voice booming like artillery. You were following prejudice. Don't you dare insult us with that excuse. His words hit harder than any weapon. Linton's mouth snapped shut. Harold closed his eyes briefly, letting the chant wash over him. For 70 years, He had been unseen, his service ignored, his body profiled. And now, at last, the truth had been spoken, not by him, but for him. By a man whose life he had saved, whose testimony could not be dismissed. At 420, Eastwood Heights Park had become something more than a park. It was a courtroom, a battlefield, a stage of reckoning. The officers stood on trial before their community. The dog at Harold's side was no longer their weapon, but their betrayal. The colonel's words had shifted the weight of the entire moment, and Harold Benton, sitting on a bench beneath an old oak tree, was no longer invisible. He was undeniable. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the park had become a storm. Not of fists or fire, but of voices of outrage sharpened by truth. The revelation from Colonel Samuel Price, his booming testimony that Harold Benton had carried him 3 kilometers through gunfire more than 50 years earlier, had cracked open the illusion of control. The crowd, now 70 strong, erupted into fury that could not be contained. A teenager's voice rang out first, high-pitched, raw with disbelief. "You sicked a dog on a veteran!" The words shot across the park like a flare, igniting the anger of dozens. Another voice followed, older, graver. "A Purple Heart veteran." Then a chorus. "Shame, cowards!" We saw it all, their cries coiled into one undeniable truth. The officer's authority was no longer unquestioned. It was dismantled in real time. Officer Derek Mills lowered his eyes. His silence, which had once felt like command, now looked like surrender. The weight of 70 phones recording 70 witnesses glaring pressed him down until his shoulders sagged under it. He wanted to disappear into the grass, to be anyone but the man who had stood mute while injustice unfolded. His lips parted once as if to speak, but no words came. His silence had spoken already louder than any confession. Officer Brian Keller, the K-9 handler, crouched near Ranger, his voice cracking with something dangerously close to shame. "He's never disobeyed," he muttered, shaking his head. "Never. He must have known." His words trembled, spilling into the open air, but they weren't defense, they were admission. He wasn't shielding himself from guilt. He was confessing it. His face pale, his hand trembling against the leash Keller was unraveling. Officer Craig Linton, however, refused to bow. His voice rose brittle, desperate, clinging to the last shreds of authority. "We followed procedure," he barked, sweat gleaming on his forehead. "We had a call. We had to act. This is protocol." But no one believed him. The crowd erupted in jeers. "Procedure," shouted a woman clutching her daughter. "Procedure is asking questions, not unleashing a dog." Another man bellowed, "Procedure doesn't explain your smirk when you called him a liar." The word procedure cracked in the air, exposed as nothing but a mask for prejudice. The chant began, then slow but steady. "Hero, hero, hero." It rolled through the park like thunder echoing off the fountain, the swings, the sidewalks. 70 voices, then 80 fists raised, phones aloft, faces burning with outrage. Harold Benton sat at the center of it all, still on his bench beneath the oak tree. Ranger pressed against his side, Colonel Price, standing tall beside him. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The people were speaking for him now. By 4:45, the footage had already left the park. Teenagers live-streamed the scene on social platforms. Clips hit timelines within minutes, the unleashing of the dog, the sudden halt, the nuzzle against Harold's chest, the colonel's booming testimony. Views skyrocketed, 10,000 in 5 minutes, 50,000 in 15. By the time the sun began to sink lower, the number had already reached hundreds of thousands. The world was watching Eastwood Heights. City officials arrived before 5 o'clock, their arrival marked by the screech of tires and the glare of flashing lights. SUVs rolled to the park's edge, Doors flung open, aides scrambling with phones pressed to their ears. The mayor herself strode into the circle, flanked by advisors and police brass, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The video was already playing on the screen of her aide's tablet. The entire city council had seen it. Millions online had seen it. The crowd parted reluctantly, their anger still simmering, their chants still echoing. But their eyes never left the officers, whose faces were now pale, their badges heavy as lead. Mills stared at the ground, his silence suffocating him. Keller's lips moved silently, as if whispering an apology he didn't know how to make. Linton stood rigid, jaw clenched, trying to hold on to the posture of command, but every twitch betrayed panic. The mayor's voice cracked the silence, sharp, clipped, furious. What in God's name happened here? Her eyes scanned the scene, the veteran, the colonel, the dog pressed into Harold's chest, the sea of recording phones, the officers standing like guilty statues. She didn't need an answer. The truth was playing on every screen in the nation. Outrage rippled again, voices rising to meet hers. "Hold them accountable," shouted a man near the fountain. "Fire them," yelled a teenager with his phone raised high. "Justice for Harold," screamed a woman, her voice breaking with tears. The chants roared, merging into one unstoppable demand. Accountability. Mills finally spoke, his voice trembling, almost inaudible. I should have stopped it." His admission barely carried past his lips, but microphones caught it. Phones caught it. The internet would carry it further than he could imagine. Keller followed his voice, cracking, louder, tears welling in his eyes. "I let the leash go. I let it happen. And the dog had more humanity than I did." His words landed heavy, raw, undeniable. Linton blustered again, raising his voice in desperation. "We were doing our job," he shouted, but the crowd drowned him out. Boos rained down, phones zoomed in, witnesses shouted back, "Your job is to protect, not attack. Your job is to serve, not profile." His voice shrank under the fury, his authority dissolving. The mayor turned to Harold, then her expression softening, tears threatening to break through her steel facade. "Mr. Benton," she said, voice cracking, "I am so sorry. This is not who we are." Harold raised his tired eyes, his voice low, but carrying like a bell through the chaos. "It is who we are," he said, "but it doesn't have to be who we remain." The words hit harder than any accusation. The crowd fell briefly silent, reverent, before erupting into cheers, applause, shouts of agreement. Phones captured his every syllable, transmitting it live to millions who now hung on his words. By 5 o'clock, national outlets had picked up the story. News vans lined the edge of the park, reporters speaking breathlessly into cameras. Anchors across the country interrupted broadcasts. Breaking news: Police K9 refuses to attack veteran in Eastwood Heights. Viral footage raises questions of profiling, prejudice, and procedure. The reckoning was no longer confined to one city. It had become a mirror held up to an entire nation. And still, Harold Benton sat, steady, silent, his purple heart patch glinting in the fading light. Ranger pressed against him, tail still thumping softly, a reminder that instinct had remembered what prejudice had tried to erase. Colonel Price stood beside him like a sentinel, his presence undeniable proof of truth. The crowd surrounded them, a living jury, delivering its verdict, guilty of prejudice, guilty of silence, guilty of forgetting who deserved respect. The officers stood exposed, their authority shattered not by force, but by truth. No badge, no uniform, no excuse could shield them from the weight of 70 witnesses and millions of eyes beyond the park. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Eastwood Heights had been a park. By 5 o'clock, It had become a reckoning. By 6 o'clock that evening, the park was no longer just a park. It was a monument to revelation, to outrage, to truth ripped bare before the eyes of a city and a nation. The video had crossed 1 million views before sundown. By midnight, it had reached 10 million. But numbers could not capture the weight of what had transpired beneath the oak tree where Harold Benton had sat quietly invisible only hours before. That place had transformed from a bench into a battlefield, and from a battlefield into a sanctuary of memory. Weeks later, when the shouting had softened into policy debates, when the city council chambers overflowed with citizens demanding accountability, the oak tree still stood. And at its base on the weathered bench, a new plaque gleamed in the sunlight. The inscription was simple, but unflinching. Harold Benton, soldier, witness, survivor. Beneath those words were 3 dates: his year of birth, the year he had been wounded in combat, and the year the park became the stage of his reckoning. 3 markers of a life lived in service, in silence, and finally, in truth. Flowers gathered at the base of the bench. Some left dog tags, some left folded flags, some left handwritten notes that read, "Thank you for sitting. Thank you for staying." Ranger was there too. The 80-pound German shepherd who had once been leashed as a weapon now roamed freely at Harold's side. The city, after much debate and pressure, had retired him from police service. To return him to the kennel would have been a betrayal of the moment. So Ranger became Harold's companion, his shadow in the twilight years, a living reminder that memory outlives prejudice. Children who had once feared the dog now approached him with hesitant smiles, patting his head as Harold nodded approvingly. He remembers better than most people, Harold would say, scratching the fur behind Ranger's ears. And he'll remind you to remember too. Every morning at 8, Harold returned to that bench. He and Ranger would sit together as the city passed by. At first, people stared, unsure if it was safe to approach, unsure if Harold even wanted company. But slowly, steadily, the rhythm changed. Strangers stopped to shake his hand. Veterans saluted him. Mothers brought their children to hear his story. Teenagers asked him to tell them what really happened, not just what they saw on their phones. Harold would tell them the same thing each time. His voice was low, roughened by age, but steady with conviction. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes when truth refuses to bow. The words etched themselves into the minds of those who heard them repeated in classrooms, written on posters, shared in speeches. It became a mantra of sorts, not just for Eastwood Heights, but for communities far beyond its borders. By the 3rd month, schools organized trips to the park. Teachers brought students to sit on the bench to read the plaque to hear Harold speak. One little girl, no more than 8 years old, tugged on his sleeve one morning. "Mr. Benton," she asked, "were you scared?" Harold looked at her, his eyes softening, and answered honestly, "Yes, child. I was scared every second. But being scared doesn't mean you run. It means you hold on, even if all you can do is sit still." The city itself began to change. Body cameras became mandatory with strict oversight from civilian review boards. Training manuals for officers now included the Eastwood Heights incident as a case study not of defiance, but of dignity. Ranger's moment of refusal was played in lecture halls as evidence that instinct sometimes carried more justice than protocol. The phrase, "Don't be a Linton," became slang among recruits, shorthand for the arrogance that destroys trust. For Harold, the recognition was bittersweet. At 70 years old, he had lived long enough to know that promises could fade as easily as applause. Yet he also saw something he hadn't seen in decades: young people carrying the fire forward. A group of teenagers formed the Benton Initiative, a youth-led movement focused on civic engagement and community oversight of policing. They wore shirts with Ranger's silhouette on the front and Harold's words on the back: "Truth refuses to bow." By the one-year anniversary, the park overflowed with thousands who came to honor him. The mayor spoke, city officials stood in solemn silence, but it was Harold's voice that carried the day. Leaning on his cane, Ranger sitting loyally at his side, he addressed the crowd gathered beneath the oak. "I never asked for this moment," he began. "I only asked to sit. But when silence is broken, it can echo louder than gunfire. And when truth stands tall, even 70 years of being unseen can't bury it." His words were met with a thunder of applause, but Harold only raised a hand, quieting them. "Don't clap for me," he said, his eyes scanning the faces lingering on the teenagers and children in the front row. "Clap for yourselves when you refuse to look away. Clap for yourselves when you speak up, when you hold power accountable. Clap when the day comes that men like me don't need plaques to be seen." Ranger barked once, sharp and clear, as if sealing the speech. The crowd laughed through their tears, clapping anyway, because they could not help themselves. And still, even with the plaque, even with the reforms, Harold Benton remained cautious. Late at night, as he stroked Ranger's fur, he whispered to himself that change was fragile, that justice had to be guarded like a flame in the wind. Yet for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to hope. Not because the system had transformed overnight, but because people had. He saw it in their eyes, in their words, in their willingness to remember. By 7 in the evening, as the anniversary crowd dispersed and the park grew quiet again, Harold remained on the bench. Ranger curled at his feet. The sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson light, spilling across the plaque at his side. He traced the engraved words with his fingers: soldier, witness, survivor. He breathed deeply, the air cool against his lungs, and smiled faintly. "Not forgotten," he whispered. "Not anymore." The legacy was not the plaque. It was not the videos or the chants or the policies. It was the fire carried forward by every young person who heard his words, by every officer who chose conscience over silence, by every stranger who decided to see rather than look away. And in that fire, Harold Benton knew lived the truth that would outlast him. For as he had told them again and again, with the steady clarity of a man who had given his life to survival, change doesn't come from silence. It comes when truth refuses to bow. What happened to Harold Benton in Eastwood Heights was more than a single afternoon in a park. It was a mirror held up to America. A 70-year-old black veteran, a man with a Purple Heart on his jacket, and scars older than the officers who confronted him, was nearly torn apart, not for what he did, but for who he was. And yet one unleashed dog, one stunned pause, one whispered recognition, "You remember me, don't you, boy?" was enough to stop an injustice and ignite a movement. That moment reminds us all silence will never protect us, and change does not come from compliance. It comes when truth refuses to bow. The lesson for every American citizen is clear. Whether you are 16 or 60, whether you served in uniform or never wore one, you carry both a burden and a power. The burden is memory of those who came before us, who fought, who bled, who were silenced in parks, streets, and courtrooms. The power is voice, the ability to record, to share, to stand, to refuse to look away. In just 2 minutes of footage, teenagers in Eastwood Heights transformed a local injustice into a national reckoning. By the end of 24 hours, tens of millions had watched, debated, and demanded accountability. That is the scale of our responsibility. So to every viewer, don't treat Harold's story as just another headline. Treat it as a call. When you see injustice, don't whisper, speak. When someone is silenced, don't scroll past share. When power hides behind procedure, Remember that procedure without conscience is prejudice in disguise. If a 70-year-old man can sit still in the face of a charging dog, then surely we can stand firm in the face of indifference. And now, if you believe stories like Harold Benton's matter, stories of dignity, memory, and justice, do your part. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next voice that deserves to be heard. Click that like button to push this story higher. Share it with 3 friends today, and drop a comment about where you're watching from. Because one voice may be ignored, but 10,000 voices cannot be silenced. Harold's legacy is not only in a plaque that reads, "Soldier, Witness, Survivor." It's in us, in what we choose to do today, tomorrow, and every day after.